the specialist training that comes.
Getting those conflict resources sorted on Dropbox too.
Yes, I'm not sure why they didn't come up, but they're all there now.
Yeah.
They're all there now. Yep. Great. Okay, let's just have a little bit of a look at this one as we work through. This is the theory of the critical few. So sit back. The notes of this will be in your Dropbox, so you'll be able to follow it on. But just let's talk it through and reflect as we go. So the critical few is it's an idea identified by the Harvard business team as they've looked at particularly transitions which have gone well, and what are the three dimensions that have been critical around that. And I have employed this now in a couple of congregations over the last probably 2 years and found that yes, this is actually quite valuable and it works. So we'll just talk about the principles that are up here. So it comes out of some work on cultural change management a couple of years ago. I've got no idea how you say that, Katzenbach Centre. The idea here that the majority of big picture change management programs don't actually really work, partly because they come adrift on the internal culture of the organisation. And so somebody at the top has a great idea, let's change everything, but the system itself puts up resistance to that change. So we've been through a little bit of systems theory, and we'll just revisit that as we go here. What they did find, that only a small number of quite important behaviours or elements that carried on the past, the positive elements of the past that were modelled by informal leaders actually were critical to change. So there's a couple of really important things in here. One is the continuity with the past that is found to be really important, and the informal leaders, not the formal leaders who are making the change, but these are what we call the first follower leaders. So the ones who step forward after the first leader has come up with the vision, shared the vision with people, set the change in process. They remain a lone voice until somebody walks up and says, this is a good idea, let's do it. And who that person is and the way they operate is absolutely critical. They're what we call the primary or the critical informal leaders. And so one of the things we found, if I can be, you know what I'm talking about here, Kevin, but we faced a very major change process, and we're still working this through, in one of the large Newcastle Anglican churches. Very significant group of people opposed to change. A few key people at the top who were very positive about the change, but the system was resisting their leadership. And so we had to work around who in this congregation are a group of people that people actually trust and believe in, who are not part of the formal leadership structure, but they are, if we can get them on board, then they will lead the rest of the group of people into a mindset change.
Are you talking about formally getting them on board, or just leaving them not formally?
No, I'm talking about formally getting them on board in an informal way.
Because the dilemma we've all seen is you need to introduce something, so the church meeting elects a committee of the 5 most trusted people, and immediately stops trusting them.
Exactly right, exactly right. So the insight in here, which we'll drill down to in a minute, is that the nature of these informal leaders are people who are not on that committee.
Yeah.
All right? Yeah. And so they're still with the congregation in that sense. They're part of the non-trusting group. Yeah. But if you can win them over, a couple of key, the idea here only requires a couple of key people there to be won over, and you do that informally. So you don't, last thing you do is you appoint them to the formal group, because the moment you do that, they're the enemy. Yeah. So keep them where they are, but recruit them to the viewpoint. So if I can be really blunt here, I think Kevin knows what I'm talking about. We found a doctor and his wife in this group that were really well respected by the group of people who were the resistors. And they had previously had lots of questions and issues. So we actually sat down with them and we brought them right into the inner knowledge of everything that was happening. We didn't appoint them to any committees, didn't appoint them to any formal role, but we said we just really would like you to know this clearly so you can see where we want him to go and why we want him to do this. So extra time, we gave them access to confidential information that other people didn't have, and trusted them with that. And once they were convinced, things really need to change here, they then kind of, I mean, it sounds a little bit subversive, but they actually went back to the group and said, we need to trust these people and we need to go on this. And we haven't got there completely yet, but we're on the way. So they were an informal group of people that needed to grasp it, and they were highly respected and trusted in that group. So that's what we mean here by the kind of the trusted informal leaders. So here's the critical few. These are the three critical elements. So number one is identify a few existing positive organisational or church traits which can evolve to provide the base for specific changes. So these are things that you're going to reinvest. So let me work this through with an example. One of the biggest change things I ever had to work with was in our local town. I chaired our quite large 500 kid school, and we had a section of the school which was K to 2 on a separate campus. It was called the Little School. I went through it as a child. Okay. And it was much loved by every parent and every person, everybody who'd been through the Little School, just absolutely loved the Little School. K to 2, that's all it was. Massive playground, fantastic areas, built in the late 1950s, early 1960s, for a big development that had gone on in our town. But that's when they were building the hydroelectric dams in the mountains of Tasmania. And a lot of these kids were all bussed in from a wilderness area where the families all lived. And so we needed massive school development in our town over that period. So the Little School was built out of that, and people had just really fond memories of it. And because 2-year-olds love their parents, grade 2s love their parents and want them to come to school, grade 3s, 4s, 5s want their parents to stay home and let them be, primary school kids. Parents were welcome in the grade 1, in the K to 2. Teachers involved parents in the classroom. There was a huge lot of activity. Dads all came and built playground equipment. It was just the best loved place. And we had to shut it down, all right? So, because it was no longer safe on a whole range of issues. There was road safety issues, there's a heap of stuff. Anyway, so facing the issue of closing the Little School in our town, everybody knew this was just Nightmare Alley, and we would have riots in the town facing this. So we had to work out, all right, what's the things that everybody loves about the Little School? So in our quiet consultation with parents and with others, we identified a critical set of things that people loved about the Little School. So one of the things they loved was parent involvement. One of the things they loved was the fact that little kids at grade 2 led the assembly, and every parent came and watched their 2-year-old, at the time when the 2-year-olds led the assembly. Now, the average primary school, you never get, not the 2-year-old, grade 2s. You don't normally get grade 2s leading assemblies, so it's the grade 6s. So we had to work out, okay, how do we do this? So we identified about 4 or 5 key values that we wanted to maintain in this thing called the Little School. And we said, we're going to build a new Little School. It's actually going to be better than the old Little School, and it's going to still be a Little School. It's going to be a place where grade 2s still lead the assemblies. It's going to be a place that parents we're going to build a parents' room in the school, in this area. Now it's going to be attached to our main campus, but we're going to fence it off. It's going to be a separate area so that the 2-year-olds or grade 2s, not 2-year-olds, the grade 2s all play happily, in their own area, have their own kind of spaces and things that can happen. And once we had convinced the community, and then I went through the list of things that were wrong with the current Little School, and it was a horror list, to be honest, of situations, and the potential of somebody actually losing their life was reasonably high, given the amount of road crossings that we had in a town that was having increasing traffic issues, particularly with tourists who weren't watching, they were looking at murals, not watching for primary school kids, crossing a main crossing during the day, not just at morning and evening when school broke out. We actually had 500 student crossings of a main road during school hours as kids moved between campuses to go to the library and internet access. So we thought, someone's going to get run over here, before on our watch, and we said, it's not going to happen, so let's change. So once we'd outlined those things, it provided a base for people to say, okay, we are prepared to go with this because we see the values will be respected in a new way. Now, the actual parent dynamics look very different. Even though it's the Little School, it's attached to a big school, but we managed to keep the values translated from the old to the new in a way that worked. Does that make sense? Just doing that. So that's the first one. The second one is identify a couple of new behaviours that are going to be different in the situation that can actually signify that we're in a new place. So these are concrete ways of doing things that signify the change. And so thinking about shifting to a discipleship-based thing, what would be the discipleship behaviours that indicate we've changed on this? And so you work out, can we be really specific and clear about some behaviours which indicate that we have actually changed? So we're no longer a program service-based church, we're a disciple-making church. What are those, can we clearly articulate what those behaviours are? And then you collaborate with a few authentic, informal leaders who are actually the influential first followers. They're the first ones to get this on board, and they are the ones to demonstrate these new behaviours in the new environment so that people can actually begin to see this through modelling on how this happens. And so finding these key people who are not part of the kind of leadership of the situation, who are always in times of change just slightly ostracised, and people distance themselves because they're actually not got yet on board with the change. These are the informal leaders who are part of the body of people who begin to model the new way. And you give them some kind of advanced training, extra information, extra privilege to what's going on in here, because they are the key people that are going to model this for other people who are part of the informal structure. Now, is this all making sense, people? Let's drill down a little more. You've all seen this one. We've had this up before. This is the systems map. So the change here is all articulated in the formal column. The resistance all comes from the informal and the tacit columns. So basically we're talking about getting into the informal, finding those people who don't have the formal roles, finding those values which have become informal in the system, and finding the behaviours that we need to have behind the scenes that actually support the transformation. So we're seeking to bring alignment between the formal and the informal now in a time of transformation and change by deliberately working on the informal side of things. So we've seen the systems one. Let's just talk here about the constant elements of change. So working out what are these few constants that we actually have to articulate that are part of the past, they're going to be reinvested or redeveloped or reformed in the new, but we can actually use them as ways of providing the continuity over the point of change. So they need to be distinctive. This is what makes us different. So the one thing we had in our favour around the little school thing was that word little. This is what makes this a little bit unique and different. Not every place in Tasmania had a K-2 separate located campus. And so we did, and made it a little bit unique, even though the rest of the school was kindergarten right through to grade 10, and then the vet program through to grade 12. We had that, and everybody said, we want to keep this. We don't want to lose this. This is really great. This is what makes Sheffield unique. It's what makes Sheffield different. You know, if you just make this another normal primary school, we don't want to be on board. So we had to say, okay, we're going to keep this idea of a little school, but we actually need to significantly update and change it. So we're not going to turn it now into a normal primary school. We're going to keep the same, but in actual fact, it's going to look like a normal primary school because it's all going to be on the one campus, and we're going to do things, you know, much more cooperatively with the main campus. But we need to preserve this little school. So we kept that value that was distinctive and clear that this is who we are. It needs to have a little bit of what I would call emotional power. So it's an idea or a term that people value. And so that the word little for us was critical. We needed to keep that term because everybody loved the idea of little. It meant that parents were included, meant that little kids led. They wanted to keep that. So we had to insist that these things will remain because they are valuable. Widely recognised as being valid. Everybody could see that was important to keep it, and some potential for greater realisation with the change. And so there were actually things that we could significantly develop in terms of the new area for children to lead was a much better area, and the possibility of some better resources for parents involved in the school also improved as we relocated to a new centre. So we had the ability for better realisation with the change than we had with keeping it the way it is. So this is working out what is continuous, what values can be celebrated, how we do that. Examples, thoughts, reflections here?
I promise that you're never allowed dancing.
Okay, all right, yes. Okay.
Sounds like it would probably be easier to do sometimes than at other times.
Yeah.
One of those connecting ideas.
Yes.
Values.
Yeah. But the effort made to locate those and articulate them is probably worth it. Because it makes the change much more manageable for people if they realise what's not going to change here, even though it's going to be reinvested in a new way.
I'm just wondering though how often you struggle to find things, like the nature of the change might mean that it's really hard to find things that can
Yeah.
an investment in those things can still be retained.
Yeah.
Yeah, is that, I'm not thinking of examples now, I'm just kind of
Have I told you the story about the very generous donor in the Battery Point Anglican Church? Okay, so this would be an example.
you don't want it, I don't think.
No, but basically he said but the whole church was discussing what changes needed to be made, and this is, as you know, it's a very old historic church which can't physically change a lot because of error existing and a whole range of things. But he basically said, what's important to me is the history of this church as a place of meaningful outreach to the community of Battery Point in Hobart. So he said, I know that I can never be a part of what needs to happen here in the future because this community is changing beyond me. It's now very trendy, young, professionals. There's a couple of, if you know the area in Hobart, there's a whole bunch of breakfast shops where all the professionals go and eat breakfast together around the edges of Jackson's and Co. And there's a whole, it's a very trendy area. And he said, look, the older folk here are not going to be a part of the future. But he said, what's important to us is that some kind of witness for the Christian gospel is maintained in this community that is connected to this church. So what I want to do is, I can't be the change, I can't be part of it, but here's $300,000 to put into a fund to ensure that this church has a continuity of gospel outreach in this community, because that's what this church is about. So he was actually opening the door completely to say there's a value here that I have, which is that this church continues to be a meaningful part of outreach to this locality. I can't be a part of that, but I would like to see it happen. And so here's some resources, because this value is important to me, that this church remains relevant to our community. And he said, I want it to be attached to our church, I want it to be something fresh, something new. I know I probably won't like it. That's what he said, honestly. He said, I probably won't like it and find it comfortable, but I want to see it happen because this is really important to me. Here's something to contribute.
You're changing cultures and stuff originally. When I went to the church I'm at now, the announcements were the major cultural part of church service, but they were abusive. People would get up and say, you've got to come to this, you've got to come to this, you've got to do this. The first week I was there, one guy got up and said, this program only had 20 people at it because you're all slack. So at the first business meeting, I cancelled announcements in church.
Right, okay.
But I had to do it carefully. But looking through some of this stuff, and not knowing this stuff, I think I did it right.
Okay.
Because what happened was people started saying, it's great that we don't have a 15 to 20 minute break in the middle of the service of our worship.
Yeah.
And that was the people in the pew saying that. The worship leaders were going,
yeah.
I don't have to cut 4 songs out of service.
Right, yes.
But the whole culture was, and the people who were getting up weren't doing it actually to abuse anyone, they were getting up because they needed to be seen.
Yes, okay.
We had to break that culture.
Yeah, yes.
But what we ended up doing, right, and what we had to say was, well, how are we going to get information?
Yeah.
Well, they get it before and after the services on screens, they get it in the bulletin, they get it in e-news, they get it on Facebook. So now we have 8 different ways of giving the same information that they could have got once.
Yes. Yeah.
But I didn't realise we did it right.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep, absolutely. Okay, everybody. Yep.
Yeah, just through the transitional change, just in, we call it a values process, but
Yes.
identifying things that make us unique.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
that we are going to continue.
Yes.
And
Yep.
that is separating the value or the thing that's unique from its,
Yes.
for how it's,
Yeah.
demonstrated or
Yeah.
played out in the life of the church. So how it's,
Yeah.
how it functions
Yeah.
might change,
Absolutely.
but the actual value itself.
Yeah.
And some people connect the value to the particular program or
Yes,
the practice
exactly.
of it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I found it helpful to try to help churches distinguish
Yeah.
the difference
Yeah.
between the value and the practice.
Yes.
That
Practice
actually,
and principle.
yeah,
Yeah.
we're going to hold on to that
Yes.
and reinterpret it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the classic principle practice thing. Most churches lock onto the practices and forget the principles. And so this is a part of let's drill underneath. Let's exegete the principles, and then try to work out how can we re-express them in a new way. And when people can become clear on what the principles are and be committed to them, we have a chance of the transition.
Part of the challenge we found in my context is that we've got people who have been with us for a long time, similar to yourself with the little school story
Yeah.
group. Well, we've got about a third of our people who've joined us in the last 5 years. And so
Yes.
they're getting the values of who we are now,
Yes.
but they don't know the historic or particularly care about a lot of the historic stories. So
Yes.
managing 2 quite different groups
Yes, absolutely.
around changes, it's been
Yeah.
tricky.
Yes, absolutely.
For those sort of reasons.
Yeah.
So part of what we've been doing is trying to, where possible, share stories.
Yes.
Even though sometimes people aren't going to connect, but then look at the value underneath
Yeah.
the story as well.
Yep. And reinvesting those values in the new is what this is
Yeah.
about. Okay. These are the behaviours. Yep. Ooh, go back. There we go. What I call positive aligned behaviours, or behaviours that are aligned with the new way of doing things in a positive way that is inspiring, helpful for other people. So it's working out what behaviours get put in place which actually embody the change. So there's an interesting school of thought on this, that sometimes people actually learn the behaviour before their mindset changes. And so for some key people, their mindset change in that neutral zone's got to precede the new behaviour, but there is another group of people who actually learn the behaviour and then the mind follows that new behavioural way of doing things. And so they need to be visible, distinctive practices. So people need to see people doing things differently in the life of the church. And they say, okay, this is what this change is about. It's actual different behaviour. They need to carry some consequence for the organisation. In other words, they're not just Mickey Mouse things. These behaviours actually are quite different and they mean something. In other words, they indicate that things really are quite different in the way that we do things. They matter in that sense. Need to be easily modelled and replicated, sometimes contagious just through natural networks and peer relationships. They need to be coherent, they need to make sense. And so if we're talking about a shift to disciple making, then maybe people are not attending a traditional church program because they're actually known to be spending one-to-one discipling time with 3 other people in the life of the congregation. That's what they're doing. And so, and that's seen, people see them in the coffee shops meeting one-to-one with other people, or they're observed, or people report, I had my meeting this week with so-and-so and so-and-so, and I really feel like I'm growing in my faith and life. So those sorts of things are clear and visible in the life of the church. And where this integrates with the next slide is these get modelled not by the leaders, because everybody expects the leaders to be doing this, they actually need to be modelled by the key informal leaders. It's the first couple of what we call the first followers, or the first primary and secondary followers, the small group of people who are the first to implement the change amongst the what's the ordinary group of people. Is this making some sense here? So, is there any comment on this one? Identify actual practical behaviour.
Tim, it's not so much a comment on this one, but a question in terms of, you know, the old bell curve of change,
Yes.
early adopters, late adopters.
Yes, yeah.
In terms of finding the peer relationships and natural networks, would you, is it more effective to find those who are always going to be the early adopters just because they love change? You know, somebody wants the latest iPad or iPhone.
Yeah.
Or is it somebody, I know, I was thinking you in. Or is it somebody, is it better to find somebody who might be more reluctant late adopter or middle adopter, but who might have the eye of, well, you know, Vivian always goes for new things, because
Yeah.
it's just that sort of person, why
Yeah.
bother to go with him? Was it
Yes.
better to go with the late adopters and the middle adopters who might be a bit more influential?
Yeah, I think the key word here is the influential, and those that are trusted. So I'd probably be, you know, in terms of the bell curve, be looking for people roughly at the top of the middle of the bell curve,
Yep.
not necessarily just the you know, the early adopters are sometimes just it's novelty, it's not real change.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, they just jumped on it because it's the latest. We're actually looking for people who would get the need for a real change. So as we were thinking through who do we go for in up in Newcastle around modelling this, we wanted people who were kind of right in the middle of this other group but were well respected and were influential in terms that if people knew that they had moved to a new attitude and a new change in this, that would carry some weight in the community. That was important to people.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so you're not looking for necessarily the systemically positional leaders, but the relational influences that are there. And sometimes those people have actually been reluctant to be in formal leadership, just simply by who they are.
What if they're one and the same? What if most of the influential people also happen to be the key formal
Yeah.
structure people?
The people who've made the decision for change and who are the governing leaders of the church are often distrusted in change processes. So it really can't be them. You've got to step outside that group to the group of people who are the people who sit around the barbecue on you know, Saturday night and discuss the church. And you know, somebody says, so what do you think about this? And this is the group who the ones that people listen to around the barbecue, you know, on Saturday night as they're discussing life in the church, who their viewpoint carries weight. That's who we're looking for, yeah. And they are the ones that need to be found. So let's go to that, because that's the critical one here. These are the authentic informal leaders. So they don't have formal roles of power, but they're critical to effective change management. So they, if they get it, then they can actually communicate this kind of sense that this is really important, we all need it, we all want it. They are actually not change agents in the sense that they are the top-down messengers explaining to the church what this is about, doing it, but they or being seen to be the number one drivers, but they are what we call the first followers, the primary people that the local people work on and get. Is all this making a bit of sense? Mm-hmm. So let me show you the little video if I can make this work. Have you all seen Dancing Man? Mm-hmm. Okay, so do I need to play it?
Yeah.
Okay. You haven't seen?
Does some of this team depend on the dynamics of church size?
Yes.
So the influential people whether that's formal or informal in a smaller church might overlap.
Yeah. Yeah. So in smaller churches, often a lot of people got positional leadership spaces, but I would still be looking for people that are not on the formal leadership. if at all possible, that they occupy a place and space. And nearly every church has got some key relational influences who, for whatever reason, have not ended up on the diaconate, the church council, the staff team, whatever. They're there, and in moments when you get change, churches just naturally polarise to those that are driving this forward. And you've all seen the teardrop diagram. By definition, they move to the front of the teardrop. So that's the sharp, pointy edge. And they all, the further they move, the more they articulate the change, the more tension we've got to everybody back here, because they're pushing this way, and there's just a little bit of slack pickup before this group starts to move. Now the danger here is that any of those tension lines snap, and this little group of people become a spaceship, and we've lost them. Away they go, and they end up breaking connection with the rest of the people. And we had that happen in our own church. It was a sad reality. We were not able to hold one particular group, wanted to move really fast on a range of issues. They formed a Bible study group. Then they got their own internal leadership, and we were trying to hold them back and saying, look, no, we'll all catch up with you, but eventually they decided, no, we're going to come and start their own thing. So hang off they went. It happens in those situations. Now sadly in that circumstance they didn't have the long-term capacity to hold it together, and within a few years it had all flung itself apart, and we lost some really good people who no longer journey in the Christian faith. Out of a that was one of the sad stories around those things. But so keeping the cutting edge, keeping those links back to the main group of people, which is these informal leaders back here, is really critical for that to flow on, to stop what we call the space shuttle effect, which is the blast off of the disconnect. Okay, so you all seen Dancing Man? Oh, okay. So you watch the guy here who decides to have a little dance.
You got the sound with you?
Is the sound? I don't know. Is there much sound with this one?
There was a commentary.
I think there is a commentary, isn't there? Yes, there is. Let's just go here. HDMI box. Oh yeah, let's just see whether we get it going. Have you got? Is there sound here in the room?
So we should have sound in theory. Does that have? What about just do that?
No, we can try it. Yeah.
Well, there's sound, so the computer's not sending it to.
Okay, I'll just run. All right, mic, headphones, speaker out. Oh, headphones probably.
Headphones.
Keep going. Yep,
we got it.
all right. Let's just make sure that's not going to blast everybody from here to Kingdom
I'm
Come.
happy with it.
Is it going?
I haven't been to that meeting, but I have actually.
Really? Brother.
So it had sound, and there's
Pick me up.
Sounds on. That's my speakers. Speakers using USB.
There's a button on it. That one.
Okay. That seemed to be running very fast, right?
Win-win.
Yeah, we've got it. We've got it. It's easy for anyone else.
Now here comes the first follower with the crucial role. He publicly shows everyone else
put you back. Here we go. So here's our dancing man.
Start to finish in under 3 minutes and dissect some lessons. First, of course, a leader needs the guts to stand alone and look ridiculous. But what he's doing is so simple, it's almost instructional. This is key. You must be easy to follow. Now here comes the first follower with a crucial role. He publicly shows everyone else how to follow. Notice how the leader embraces him as an equal. So it's not about the leader anymore, it's about them, plural. Notice how he's calling to his friends to join in. So it takes guts to be a first follower. You stand out, you brave ridicule yourself. Being a first follower is an underappreciated
This was not set up, this
form
was
of
just
leadership.
what somebody
The first follower transforms a lone nut into a leader. If the leader is the flint, the first follower is the spark that really makes the fire. Now here's the second follower. This is a turning point. It's proof the first has done well. Now it's not a lone nut and it's not two nuts. 3 is a crowd and a crowd is news. A movement must be public. Make sure outsiders see more than just the leader. Everyone needs to see the followers because new followers emulate followers, not the leader. Now here come 2 more people, then 3 more immediately. Now we've got momentum. This is the tipping point, and now we have a movement. As more people jump in, it's no longer risky. If they were on the fence before, there's no reason not to join in now. They won't stand out, they won't be ridiculed, and they will be part of the in crowd if they hurry. And over the next minute, you'll see the rest who prefer to stay part of the crowd, because eventually they'd be ridiculed for not joining. And ladies and gentlemen, that is how a movement is made. So let's recap what we've learned. If you are a version of the shirtless dancing guy, all alone, remember the importance of nurturing your first few followers as equals, making everything clearly about the movement, not you. Be public, be easy to follow. But the biggest lesson here, did you catch it? Leadership is overglorified. Yes, it started with the shirtless guy, and he'll get all the credit, but you saw what really happened. It was the first follower that transformed a lone nut into a leader. There's no movement without the first follower. See, we're told that we all need to be leaders, but that would be really ineffective. The best way to make a movement, if you really care, is to courageously follow and show others how to follow. When you find a lone nut doing something great, have the guts to be the first person to stand up and join in.
So apparently that was not a setup. That was just somebody actually, just capturing something on their phone or whatever. The lesson was drawn from that. Over here. Went back to that, and from this slide. Point of the video being, it's not the actual leader that makes the difference, it's those first 2 followers. The riskiness of that, otherwise you end up with a lone person just doing something crazy and everybody sitting back watching and there's no engagement. You basically just have a crazy dancing man. But the thing shifts when the first one comes up, and the length of time that he had to follow alone, even signalling to others to come, nobody came for a bit, and then slowly one more comes, and then the speed at which it generates out of that. So the import being the authentic informal leaders who are the first followers become the critical elements for change in here. So these are the people who they get it, they are part of it. They're not the change agents themselves, but they are key followers. So
I think it's in that video, and I think one of the important points is that leader, the shirtless guy, acknowledged his first followers as equals.
That's right, exactly.
I've seen a couple in one situation now. We've got actually a good leader.
Yes.
But actually, it's not, the followers are not equal.
Okay.
Not acknowledging them
as
equals, and I think that's part of it.
Yeah. So for the movement to actually end up with some kind of transformational change, there's that acknowledgement and inclusion from the first guy, around all of that. Okay, so just summarise it here. You're putting the critical few together. The CECs are the cultural things that are going to be reinvested, the cultural values that are going to be reinvested, the behaviours in there, and the informal leaders in here for embedding change in this. I don't know, the original author of this article loved the acronyms. I'm not quite sure how they all work, but I just call these the values, the consistent cultural values that are going to be done, the behaviours that are clear, that demonstrate the change, and then your leaders that model those behaviours, keep the cultural values in place, what is called the critical few. So I would have used this now probably in 3 consultancies where we've actually been seeking to put in place some new cultural shift or change in a place that has a level of resistance to it. And I would have to say that on the ground this works as a really healthy strategy of finding this out. So as a part of a change management thing, identify the values that are consistent, identify clear behaviours that are consistent with the change, and then identify your informal leaders who are ready to model that. Particularly as we come out of Bridges' kind of neutral zone into the application of the new, embracing that new stuff. So, comments, feedback. You see where this applies or works in your circumstance situation?
This has to happen in the neutral zone.
It comes out of the neutral zone as you enter into the embracing the new.
So I'm thinking of a few situations where we've identified the values of the past that we're taking with us in the future that need to separating the practice from the principle.
Yep.
And just to see the tension almost dropping in a room as people
see that
acknowledge.
exactly.
So we're not. The thing that I value the most is the thing that we're not changing.
Yes. Yeah.
And I can get on board now.
Yes.
Not in those words, but to see that in a even in a congregational setting, once when put up on the board and I think this is what you value.
Yeah.
And that's not changing.
Yes. Yeah.
I think 1 and 3 I get 40. I'm struggling a little bit with the behaviours.
Okay.
You might be changing the way a church does governance or something. What are the new behaviours? Is it just the integrity and transparency you're talking about, or is it? It's not easy to identify them, I guess.
No, so it might be that so if you're talking about, say, a shift from what might be a classic voting governing board to a group of spiritual leaders who seek to discern the will of God together, it would be a common transition that we work with. So we would actually, what are the behaviours that we would articulate in here? So it might be how do we listen to God collectively together as a group of elders in a church? What behaviour does that look like? So what does that mean about the way in which we pray? What does that mean about the way in which we approach a decision? And so if we can then identify a behaviour that's a part of that, you then want some of your key people to model that behaviour. This is what we want to do.
Just one that struck me. I was told a story of a church, I can't remember where they changed the process at a deacon's meeting.
Yep.
Where instead of just getting straight into business, they spent an hour and a half in prayer.
Okay, yes.
And the deacon's meeting only took half an hour then.
Yes, that's right.
Because they were together.
Yep.
So they changed that behaviour. It's then facilitated them working together as a team.
Yeah, Martin Luther used to say, I've got so much to do today, I'm going to have to spend extra time in prayer. Okay, any other comments on these? You find this helpful, or is this, to me it's been a critical addition to the work that we do on transformation, because it locks down just a couple of very practical steps that people can take in transition management and leadership, and on the ground our experience is that this works.
It is interesting about the behaviour being ahead of the value change.
Yeah.
In one sense, that it lets you not worry about the people that are slow to catch up.
Yes.
You're not forcing them. In a sense, you're providing mechanisms where the way they engage can come on board.
Yes, yeah.
So,
And we do know that sometimes when people actually model and express behaviour, the results of that behaviour help their thinking to catch up. You know, where they always thought this is not the right way to do it because it doesn't work. Sometimes they find it actually does work, and new things come out of that.
But it actually validates the fact that not everybody has their values.
Yes.
But if the behaviours model what we want,
then
their values can catch up.
Yeah.
Good, Tony can follow the way of thinking.
It is, yes. Yep. Yep.
So if you put that in terms of, you know, ministry standards and say churches, you're getting people to have a system of behaviours, even though you really wish they just love to have a safe church.
Exactly, yes, that's right. Yeah.
But the process actually will bring some people to that value.
Okay, any other observations around this one? Otherwise we'll change tack and dive into how do you as a consultant help and facilitate churches working through a process of change.
In terms of the alignment of the behaviours that you initially choose to focus on will be pretty critical.
Yes, that's right.
And alignment in two directions. There's got to be sufficient alignment with what existed before.
Yes, yep.
And sufficient alignment to the new culture that you're trying to introduce.
Yep.
So, the example that you used about shifting a board from being the classic decision-making board to being a board of spiritual leaders that identifies with the future.
Yeah.
The behaviour that you example was prayer. Well, that's got sufficient alignment to, we always pray at the start and the end of the meeting, and Lord bless the decisions that we make,
Yeah.
It's got sufficient alignment in the past, but it's also got sufficient alignment in a new direction, in an enhanced way for the future.
Yes.
So it seems to me that the alignment would have to work in both directions.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah. But it does need to be enough of a change in behaviour to signal that we are doing things differently. That this is a change. This is a different way of approaching things. Okay, we're right? All right, tuck this one away. So you've got this PowerPoint in your folder, just as a PDF file. Again, if any of you want any of these PowerPoints as PowerPoints, just let me know. I'm happy to put those in as PowerPoints if you want to be able to teach them to others or use them in a consultancy to explain things to people. So let's do that one. You'll now need your notes. Everybody got a copy of the notes? Consulting in times of change and transition for churches, and on the back of that is Lessons from the Wilderness, which is William Bridges' a few little reflective comments. So you've probably seen most of this one. There's been a few minor changes in it, but most of them are there. Okay, we're happy just to step through these. These are just some general principles. If you, as a consultant, are working with a church through a time of transition or change, working with a pastor, what are some of the consultancy issues or the training, the coaching responsibilities that you might work on with somebody around this? How about we just pick one, read it out, and we'll just reflect on it a little bit as we go. So, transitions are unique. As consultants, we're often called just to journey with people around some of the things. So these are a couple of the essential sort of steps, certainly the ones that I would use commonly in many situations. So somebody want to read the first one, and we'll just chat about it for a minute.
Helping leaders to learn to describe the change and why it must happen, and do so succinctly in 1 minute or less for each of the key communication modes. Clarity makes a lot of difference to the way people perceive change.
And if you just read that next paragraph.
Enable leaders to communicate in the 4 key modes, sharing the big picture, presenting clear facts and essential details, talking through the logical process, and showing care for individual needs and the impact on them.
So is everybody familiar with the Myers-Briggs kind of approach. So you've got the introvert, extrovert, and then the two important ones are the middle two. So this is the N and the S, which is big picture, pattern thinking, intuitive thinking, and sensory processing, which is details, facts and details. So what colour is it, how much does it cost, you know, where will it actually be, what's its location. The big picture, the N side is what are we trying to do here, what are we trying to achieve, what's the big picture. And then the T and the F, T is those people who focus logically. They need to know this process, how do we get to this decision, how's it going to be implemented, what's the time frame, that's the logical processing. And the F side is, so how's this going to impact the children in our congregation, you know, and what are we going to do with the fact that the older people now, you know, are going to be 6 months without a disabled toilet, how are we going to manage all of this stuff, what's happening for people. And then the last two are J and P, which is people who like decisions made effectively, people who like to kind of keep the options open before they close them down. The two inner ones are what we call the cognitive processes, and everybody uses all four, but people on their personality use them in very different ways. And so people don't realise that their way of explaining things to other people, and also their preferred way of hearing things explained to them, are actually quite unique. There are about 8 other ways to do it in different order. And so one of the things I actually say to leaders, sit down and work out how do you explain this change in less than a minute in each of the 4 key modes, so that you can actually talk this through in a way that people who are listening to you are going to get. So I know for some people, so I'm a big picture person, right? So if somebody doesn't give me background, history, context in the first few minutes, and they start to talk about, you know, how much it costs, where it's going to be, all the details, which are the lowest priority for me, because I need to know what are we trying to achieve here, where are we going with this, what's this about, then I'm lost. But I know full well that if I start with the big picture, because it makes sense to me, and I'm talking to somebody who couldn't care less whether we're trying to build something in the clouds or not, if we don't have the money for it, what are you even having this conversation with me about, you know? Let's talk about money and time, and can we do this? Is this realistic? Let's get the facts on the table. Once we've got the facts on the table, then I'm happy to listen to your big idea. But don't talk fairy language to me. Give me the facts, give me some hard data. Other people are really concerned as to how did we actually get here, you know? Was there a reasonable process behind this? Has somebody done, you know, is there appropriate decision making? Is this logical? Is there step by step? Can we put the process on the table and examine that we've done this wisely and well? You know, or is this just somebody's crazy idea and everybody else said yes? That doesn't float my boat. You know, I want to see that this is reasonable, it's structured, it's processed. Other people, their heart is moved by people. They want to make sure, have we listened to people? Have we consulted? Have we talked to all the stakeholders? Have we included everybody in here? I don't care about the policy, you know, and decision-making things. I need to know, have we been reasonable to people here? And people who are people will often bend the rules in order to make things happen for people, because they know we've got to do this. Now, I don't care what the council says about such and such and such and such. We've actually got to twist this so we get enough access for able to meet these needs, or able to look after these people in this sort of situation. And so being able to communicate in those 4 modes is absolutely critical for leaders, because they can carry the most people with them around the process of change. Does that make sense? Yeah, so that just, somewhere you write down those 4 modes, and I actually get, like when I'm coaching leaders through change management, I actually get them to write down their vision for the change in each of those 4 modes. And say in your first 5 minutes of talking about anything around change, make sure you have processed things in those 4 modes, in the first 5 minutes. Because then you get people on board. People know that this is not just some crazy, you know, dream or whatever, which is what they say about my ideas, if I don't include, you know, something in there that's rock solid for them. Okay, we're okay with that one? Right, someone just fly on the second one.
Consulting with the team to assist leaders understand just who is going to have to let go of what. What is ending, what is not in people's lives, positions and ministries. and what people, including the leader, should let go of.
Yeah. This is a really important step in change management, is actually, and a lot of leaders are so focused on the future and where we're going that they've not fully comprehended and articulated who is going to lose what. And you can't pass to people through the psychology of change without really being clear about what are the losses in here for people around this, and how we're going to deal with those losses appropriately. Every change involves some loss, and so processing them and articulating those losses becomes really important. You know, so for that moment, for the pastor that I was working through a couple of years ago, or the leader saying, I am no longer the leader of this community, that's a significant moment of loss. You know, even though there's some positives around it, to articulate that is clear. And for people who are losing their positions or losing their the way they've done things for a long period of time, we just need to recognise those losses and clearly understand what they are. And so it's not a bad idea somewhere in the documentation for leaders to just have a list. This is what's happened. This is where the losses are. This is who is losing what in here, just so that you can be cognizant of that without minimising it. Leaders, by definition, are future-orientated people, and they're really good at investing strongly in the future. They're often not quite as good at appreciating the cost of what's happening in that in the present. So this is where people who are a bit more pastorally orientated have an important gift to bring in this situation. Okay, any comment on that? Anybody want to fill that one out a bit? Okay, number three.
Resource leaders to make sure that steps are taken to help people respectfully let go of the past. These may include boundary actions, events that demonstrate that change has come, a constant stream of information, and understanding and acceptance of the symptoms of grieving, as well as efforts to protect people's interests while they're giving up the status quo.
So boundary events is the equivalent of your funeral, you know. So it's actually closing something well. So in our example of the little school, we had a celebration of the life of the little school. We invited every person in the community that had ever gone through there, you know, that had ever delivered milk back in the olden days, you know, hot milk left it out in the sun, had ever had anything to do with the place. And we had a massive celebration of the history. Put all the class, you know, photos we could find. We had a big display board. We rounded up the old principals that we could find that had been there. And we had a day of celebration and thanksgiving for the life and contribution and the little school. And all the parents that had built playground equipment, which they're going to have to, a lot of it was being destroyed, couldn't stay and it couldn't be transferred to the new place. And so, you know, there was a lot of stuff to say goodbye to, you know, in there. And so we had a big celebration and a farewell. And to be honest, there were a few tears around, you know, around that. You know, people that have had some pretty important and significant memories of that place, and a few great stories, a few funny stories, you know. Parents and teachers that had knocked themselves out on the playground equipment. Not me, but others. And things that had happened, they were important to celebrate. So helping people do that and do that well becomes really important. And again, sometimes people are so keen to move on that they don't actually farewell the past appropriately. And sometimes a good farewell is the moment of realisation for some people that things are in fact changing. We're not continuing to do this. And so some kind of a boundary marker, the end has come, new is on its way, becomes a really important process. And to do that symbolically has value. Any reflections? Okay, someone on 4?
Guide leaders that the details of the change are planned carefully and that someone is responsible for each detail, that timelines for all the changes are established, and that a communications plan explaining the change is in place.
Yeah, so this is plan and communicate. Plan, communicate, pray. That's what good change is about. Keep the thinking going carefully. I hope I've got somewhere in here, I'm pretty sure I do, that in spite of all the best planning in the world and all the best timelines in the world, things never run to timeline and never run to plan. There's just too many, when you run change, there's too many unexpected things that come up. There's always going to be things that you just don't foresee, you don't anticipate. And so sometimes managing that is pretty important. Okay, someone on 5?
Walk with leaders through the neutral space, enabling them to communicate well in ways that keep connections alive and show concern for the congregation. Keep reiterating the VIP of transition communications. Vision, what the problem has been, why we have to do this, what it will look and feel like when we reach the goal. Implementation, step by step, how we'll get there, addressing the needs of the organisation as a whole and the individuals within it. And the part each person plays, what each person can and needs to do to help us as an organisation move forward.
Yeah. So I just keep that VIP in my brain all the time in transition communications. Whenever we are communicating anything, why are we doing this? That's the vision. What's going on here? What's happening next? What's the next step? Implementation plan. And number 3, and this is probably the most important, is what part are we wanting you to play in this? So what do you need to be doing now around walking with us in this transition? And if people are given kind of pastoral guidance on what's appropriate, what do we need them to be doing to be part of this, it keeps them focused on what's happening rather than on the resistance side, which is what can we do to stop this? How can we make this not happen? Which is where some people end up if they aren't given positive instruction about how do you be part of this. So that VIP is important. Yep, 6.
Problem solve with key leaders to create temporary solutions to the temporary problems and high levels of uncertainty found in the neutral space. Make sure people are not struggling unnecessarily. There's lots of chaos in change, as we all know, and sometimes we end up just with just little problems that come up that nobody had foreseen, people didn't see, and sometimes that can actually lead to people unnecessarily in trouble or abandoned or things not being needed. So, particularly in the neutral space, the care for people, constantly checking in with people, what's happening, are you okay, if we're working all through this, becomes really important, and there's lots of pastoral problem solving that takes place in that kind of a space. What are we going to do about this while we're in transition, while things are shifting? Good, and 7?
Help leaders help people launch the new beginning by articulating the new attitudes and behaviours needed to make the change work, and then modelling, providing practice in and facilitating those behaviours and attitudes. For example, rather than announcing a new ministry or leadership team, leaders of transition need to work through with members the skills and attitudes that such a team needs to have and provide the necessary training or resources to develop them.
Yeah. So often people put in place something at a high level without the support underneath the process of training, equipping, communicating, being clear about how this is actually different to what it was before. And so, if we're talking about, say, the shift of a church board into being a community of spiritually discerning leaders, what kind of training do people need to do that shift? How do you, so sometimes it's actually worth backing it down for a process, and before you reinstitute the new board, rather than just change it in one hit, is you run some training for what this actually will look like in the future before we put it in place. Otherwise, things can sometimes default back to what they were, just with a new name, if there's not the training and the equipping and support underneath. So having that kind of equipping plan becomes really critical. Okay, well, let's have a quick moment. We'll flick through Lessons in the Wilderness, and then we've got a little bit of an exercise to take us into lunch in some small groups. Somebody want to, just a couple of other people grab each one of these headings. Some of these you can smile at, some of these are pretty insightful. So this is William Bridges.
Don't underestimate the value of the plagues.
Yep.
To make the old system, that is Pharaoh, let go of his people, Moses called down plagues and didn't stop until the old system gave way. At this stage, problems are your friends. don't solve them, for they convince people that they need to let go of the old way.
So this is actually quite important. Every time something goes wrong with the old system, don't fix it, because it actually helps justify the reason why we went to the new. So I had an absolute gift handed me, like a gift horse, in our moment of change with the little school. I was trying to convince the government to fund our change. I had the government minister standing with me in front of the little school. And I honestly, to this day, I did not set this up. But because one of the issues was the complete access from the local community to right round every corner of the school playground, and we had a road that went right through the middle of the playground. And so it was actually quite dangerous in lots of ways. And so I stood there in front and I said to the minister, we have no control here in this area over who walks through the playground at any one point. At which point, one of the most respected Christian men of our community walked through the fence at the end of the playground with an big old trench coat on, coming home from work, and walked right across the playground in front of me and through out into a little gateway into a set of houses on the other side. I knew him really well, like a United Church guy. And I said, see, any person with any could actually walk through the playground, and they've got access to our children right here. It's like, look at this guy, walking right through here at this very moment, Now, he wouldn't have hurt a fly, and we all knew him, and you do in a country town. But the minister was suitably impressed, thinking he could have been a pedophile or anything else like that, just standing right there, and it just happened at that moment. So it was like, here's a problem. We didn't fix it by saying, okay, let's just shut the gates and make sure this all goes away. It actually worked in our favour for convincing the person we needed to get something changed, get something fixed here. So if there's a problem, keep them as problems, because they're your friends in prompting change.
Mark the ending. What a symbolic boundary event Moses had. After his people crossed the Red Sea, there was no going back.
Yeah, okay, so pretty spectacular for Moses. We can't all divide the ocean, but boundary events are important. So sometimes when things have to change, you can't go back.
Dealing with the murmuring, don't be surprised when people lose confidence in your leadership in the neutral zone. Where are we going? Does she know the way? What was ever wrong with Egypt anyway? In periods of transition, look for opportunities to have contact with the individuals in transition. Distance will be interpreted as abandonment, and show your concern by engaging them in conversation about the issues that are most on their minds. You may think there are more important things to talk about, but they don't think so.
Yeah. So this is the pastoral care of people that are just struggling. There's always murmurings in these moments. People unhappy about this. They can't quite understand why. What was wrong with the old way anyway. Are we really getting anywhere? It's not much to eat in the desert. So how do we deal with all that? That's all the murmurings of things which are pretty normal and have to be responded to pastorally, and they can be very frustrating for leaders at this time. But caring for people through that stage is really critical. Okay.
Give people access to the decision makers. Moses, aided by his mentor Jethro, appointed a new group of judges in the wilderness to narrow the gap between the people and the decision makers.
But I'm not sure I quite agree with his description of that. I think it's quite what Moses did in the wilderness was, in fact, putting some buffers between him and others in order to get the work done that was not being done because it was Moses-centric. So what he did is he gave people access to judgments and decisions and processes rather than having everything concentrated on himself in this, which is what Jethro advised him to do. So I'm not sure that this is actually access to decision makers. It's certainly access to decisions. It's getting things done. Not everybody actually had access to Moses in this situation, but they had access to Moses, what Moses could provide for them, which was wise, judiciary judgments around their needs as individuals. He had to set up a system to make sure that provision was made for people. So I'm not sure it's direct access to Moses, but it's certainly access to what he could provide for people at that point. Okay.
Work with the creative opportunity provided by the neutral space. It was in the wilderness, not in the promised land, that the big innovation took place. The 10 Commandments, the law and the new styles of worship and living were handed down. It'll be in the neutral space that many of your biggest breakthroughs occur.
Yeah. So some of the things which are undergird the eventual changes will happen in the neutral space. So these are the mindset changes, the new attitude, as Paul would say, the renewing of your mind takes place once people let go of the past, before they completely take on the behaviours. For some people, it's getting this new mindset, and that doesn't happen until you've got a bit of a wilderness experience between two spaces. So people can't just go bang from one to the other. You need that time of undoing and redoing things. So after lunch, we're going to talk about how important this is in an interim time between pastors, particularly after a long pastorate. When there's been a very long pastorate that's taken place in the church, I think we talked about this a bit last time, after 9 or so years, people forget how did we reach the decision of how these things happen. They just know this is the way we've always done it in this church. And those things get locked down and actually get rusted in. And so if a new pastor comes along and tries to change them, it is literally like unrusting stuff, and you're going to break something rather than help it adjust. And so a good interim period is like spraying CRC over everything, getting a wrench on things and just quietly, gently unscrewing everything and allowing the adjusting plates to be free. And then when the new person comes, you adjust the things to where they need to be, and then you start to wind it all back down again. And things don't break if you've got that interim space to unwind and take the pressure off everything. And that's the neutral space. That's what happens in the neutral space. Things slowly, carefully get undone. Too big a change and things will snap and break. And so you just allow the time for people to unwind, readjust, put a bit of spray on, a bit of silicone or whatever it is, neutral stuff, graphite, random things to get everything able to move freely, because there will be adjustments when the new person comes. They do things differently, and so they need to be able to move and then slowly retighten the system down to make adjustments for the new way of operating. Okay, last two.
Resist the urge to rush ahead. It seems as though little is happening in the neutral space, but this is where the transformation is taking place. Don't jeopardise it by hurrying.
Yeah, so give people plenty of time in the neutral space to make the adjustment. I keep reminding leaders, it's taken you years to get to the point of seeing this. Don't expect people to be able to move to your position in just a short time. Give them plenty of time, plenty of space.
So using Moses, that's 40 years.
Yes, that's right. I'm not sure that's exactly what is in mind, but...
and you can jeopardise it.
Yeah, you can.
Really. And one pastor who had it was a really good vision and direction, it's taken a while.
Yep.
And then he thought he'd given everyone enough time, like he said 3 months, and they won't get on board and make decisions.
Yeah.
I said, well, you need like 2 years, mate.
Yes, that's right, yeah. So most people in change work say it's a minimum of 9 months and it's a maximum of years. Yeah, for effective change management. Okay, and the last one?
Understand that neutral space leadership is special. Moses did not enter the promised land. His kind of leadership fitted the neutral zone where things are confusing and fluid. It was Joshua who could lead in the more settled state of the promised land. A new style of leadership is needed. The establishment of a new beginning requires a much more logical approach with an appeal to the follower's understanding, while the fluidity and ambiguity of the neutral zone makes an emotional connection between the leader and the followers more critical.
Yep. Okay, so again, this is why I'm a bit dubious about the exegesis of this one. I'm not sure exactly the reason that Moses couldn't enter the promised land, because he hadn't studied William Bridges' manual. I think it might be a bit more complex than that. But the point is validly made, that there are different styles of leadership that are demanded in the different moments. So there's the visionary leadership to release the past, head for the future. There's the pastoral leadership demanded through the neutral zone. And then there's the managerial administrative leadership demanded in the settling into the new zone. And they're all very different, and they're all rarely found in the same person, which is why a transitional leadership team made up of people with those 3 skill sets is really good practice. Maybe 2 or 3 people, but you need all of that there. We okay? Right, sorry, there's been a fair bit of content download this morning, so we've got about 20 minutes before we break for lunch, just before 12. How many of you got a current active change management process that you are either a part of or overseeing or involved in? Is there enough for, if we break into groups of 2, for everybody to have one of those people there, at least? So let's get into groups of 2 with somebody, if it's not you yourself, who's got an active process. And what I'd like you to think through is particularly the communication side of this. How well are you doing in communicating this, particularly in those 4 modes, to the people in your group who are having to work with this change, around what this change is, where it's up to, what the steps are, and how people can be involved at this point. So what I'd like you to do is a little bit of work on a communication plan for that, and just have something to share when we get back just before lunch. So 15 minutes of work on a current active change process that you're engaged in, and the communication plan that's connected to that. Because I would have to say the weakest link that I meet in communication in change management is communication to the congregation about where we're up to and what's going on and how they can be involved in it. Okay with that? So 15 minutes, everybody happy? Do you need to be divided up, or are you capable of self-division? Okay, let's regather, folks. Pick up one highlight out of your communication plan that you think might be important to just to share with others. Something that is important in getting right and communicating around the change that you're managing. So, can we go each group? Is there a highlight over here?
Yeah, probably the fact that all inputs were valid, that people should be able to contribute, and Ian used the phrase, it's like a European Song Festival, that everything's valid and everything goes to the vote.
Okay.
Just in collecting information, so in communicating on one, so this was church last night, they're in very much the transition period.
Yeah.
And just, as I seek to communicate, to not just assume people are hearing it.
Yes.
But to give opportunity for people to respond, to ask questions. So they appointed someone to be the facilitator of that. Everything's valid. So we want to hear everyone's concerns.
Yes. Yeah.
My reflection was people aren't raising concerns if they aren't really asking the how or the why or the when, or then they're actually not hearing what you're communicating. So that was the European. So everything's valid, and we'll listen to everything.
Yeah, I think that's really important. In times when people aren't hearing what's happening, they are actually hearing things, but they're hearing what they want to hear in there, and they're making up their own story around what's really happening, and that's the danger.
And it's a good way to gauge what people are actually hearing by the questions they're actually asking, or concerns they're raising.
Yep, good.
And not the pastor, I said, not the transitional leader. This is not your job.
Yeah. Good. Over here?
I guess one of the insights we had was with the Myers-Briggs typologies and the different questions that different people are asking, and making sure that they're all checked off, whether it be in a big communication major vision piece or a smaller kind of transitional thing that's happening, but to make sure that all of those are being
ticked off. Yeah, because people do process things very differently. Yep, good. Over here.
Well, they sorted my problem out for me. Thank you for your wisdom, guys. I suppose one of the things is about a leadership document, and I suppose breaking it down is that we want to communicate that people are to do what God calls them to do rather than what the document says. And so using that part of the process and how we get, I'm not exactly sure what I'm saying here, but I'm processing what they've said and helping with. But I think it's that whole process that I think impresses me to sort of say, okay, there's more to it than just an idea. And even to the fact that the way that we've worked it through as a leadership at church, God's come up with giving us, okay, that structure doesn't fit you. You've got people who are gifted weirdly, peculiar if you want to use that term, and they've got to be communicated to that their gifts they've got to use their gifts,
Mhm.
and if that's not on the leadership structure, we change the leadership structure.
Mm.
That's not explaining it very well, is it?
No, it's okay. Yeah. That's all right. Yep.
So I'm still processing that.
Yeah, good. All right. No, we're okay with that.
Yeah, communicating in as many ways as possible.
Yes.
So verbal, written,
Yep.
Small group
Yes.
discussion,
Yep.
forums. Yeah, so just making sure that communication is
Yep.
kind of scattergun.
Yes.
Just
Yeah.
people receive information better in different contexts.
Good. Right.
And just being personally available, so
Yeah.
Kev's there at the church regularly, even though it's not his church, and they've said to people at morning tea, you can ask these questions, and
Yes.
they've got a good timeline, there are
Yeah.
people there that, so just actually having a person that they know
Yeah.
it's okay, I can talk to them.
Yeah. Right. Good. Okay, we're just about to go to lunch, so we'll just rip around one more time. Just something that you've been reflecting on this morning, just out of all this material on change management. Because after lunch, we're going to go actually into a real live situation that I'm actually currently working through, and we'll just go step by step through each of the. It's a pastoral transition, so we'll go step by step through the various processes of helping a pastor transition from one place to another.